Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer here with the Know Your Tools t shirt, which, by the way, I have a fun story about that. And myself, Brad. And today we're talking about software as a service supply chain hacks and what you can do to protect yourself from these types of things. We're going to talk about some real world scenarios that have been in the news, and then we're going to talk about some remediation steps that you can take. And really, remediation steps also, if you are a SaaS provider, we're going to touch on some of that too. But yeah, so last week I was in Jacksonville, Florida, doing a presentation on, we call it Tales from the Trenches. I think we've done some episodes on that. And one of the questions from the audience was, we were talking about Ping Castle specifically, actually, so of interest to
Awesome.
you as well. And they were like, how can we as like, air quotes civilians, I don't know if that's the right phraseology for it, but what can we do to find some of these issues that exist in Active Directory? And I pointed the tools out. I was like, look at Purple Knight and Ping Castle. And they're like, okay, well, how do I know the tool isn't going to bring a virus into my environment? Or, when you guys are evaluating hacker tools, what is your criteria for making sure that it's safe? And I was like, it's funny you mentioned that. We literally, everybody on our team has a t-shirt that says know your tools.
Yep.
And we do vet our tools very carefully. However, if you're not, I would say, highly technical,
Mhm.
that vetting tools on your own can be a challenge. And so
Yep.
anyway, we went down this whole rabbit hole of
Yep.
talking about, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Funny story is this shirt is actually shrunk quite a bit. I think I bought like a medium, and I've been going to the gym and getting a little bit
I
more,
was going to say, did the shirt shrink or did you grow? I don't know.
get a little bit more mass on my body. So like I put it on this morning, like, oh, this is tight. I'm definitely gonna wear the tightest shirt I can find for the podcast today. So, but
I
it is
love
one of
it.
my favorite shirts because of that, like that
Mhm.
pride and that attention to detail that we try to have with everything that we do.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yep. Of course, I told him the story about me putting Tor on a hospital network by mistake, and I was like,
Nice.
and that day, a lesson was learned that I have never forgotten.
Yep. It's all about lessons.
Oh man, we all make mistakes, and the
Yep.
differences. Hopefully, we can learn from them. So, all right. So let's talk about software as a service. So I think we probably should define that roughly. I think most people may have heard the term
Yep.
SaaS or software as a service. We'll talk about that. But specifically, how that can lead to a supply chain attack or what a supply chain attack is.
Yep. Yeah. So software as a service, right? It's software that you don't host or run or manage on your own, right? It's in the cloud, as we say. It's maintained by the vendor, right? Updates and this is an important aspect of this that we'll get into, but like the updates of the software and the new code that gets pushed to that software is out of your control, right? The software, the vendor does the software development, they push the updates, they do the continuous development, the testing, the security testing, Q&A, all of that. It's all handled by the vendor, right? So software as a service, it's a service that you just sign up for and log in, right? It's like Canva or it's like Restream,
Hmm.
pretty much everything is software as a service now,
Hmm.
or it's an API or a webhook or something like that. So much of our day to day, if you look at it, it's probably pretty staggering to think like everything is an API. And you've talked about this before, Brad, too, and you share this the same as outlook is like so much of what we use day to day is an API, a software, a SaaS product, something like that.
Hmm.
So when I think of SaaS, that's what I think of, and a lot of it runs the world, even though there are still some AS400s running like airline systems and things like that.
And apparently on
Financial,
clients' public-facing networks.
yeah, yeah.
Apparently that's a thing.
But SaaS supply chain attacks, right, are what we're kind of honing in on. And supply chain attacks are attacks against the third party integrations, against the SaaS products themselves, the development life cycles, the underlying APIs themselves, the plugins. So when I think SaaS supply chain attacks or just supply chain attacks in general, that can apply to a wide range of things, and we'll get into kind of some different aspects of that and what that might be.
Hmm.
Just as like a precursor, I think of like a Chrome plugin, right, is a supply chain attack. The same as a Python library or some other programming plugin or some other programming language. The libraries that somebody uses in their project is also a supply chain attack. A third-party RMM product or network monitoring product like SolarWinds, third-party, supply chain thing. So when I think supply chain attack, I think third parties, APIs, plugins, extensions, the software update mechanisms that apply to them, and more or less taking over those, injecting malicious code, hijacking those things. And when those become compromised, the downstream customers become compromised. And we have a number of examples of that we'll share. But that's what I think of initially. So I'm curious how your kind of definitions tie into that.
Mine is incredibly simple. When I think of supply chain, I think of like trucks on the highway,
Yeah.
right? Like super simple. Like Walmart is going to have a bad day if their trucks can't reach there, or if their trucks are compromised en route, right? So, I don't know why, but the term supply chain, because it obviously precedes computing
Yep.
by us by hundreds, if not thousands of years, and
Yep.
and the cornerstone of war, of commerce, is
Yep.
is supply. And so I don't know why my brain goes to that
But it's kind of funny
automatically,
our
but
different like outlooks on it, just based on our background and experience. Like I would
mm,
clearly guess that you would go that direction, or like that would be your first instinct on it, just based on your
yep.
experience and background.
Yeah, I don't know why, man. I just it just
But no,
immediately
that's a great
creates
point.
that. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't think that this problem um, is very old, right? So what I mean by that is this is a relatively new problem that we're facing here. Historically, like maybe early 2000s, 2002, 2005, there weren't a lot of SaaS offerings out there, right? However, what there were partnerships and vendor connections into environments. And so one of the things that I think of is, like, in the banking world, very few US banks have core processing on prem,
Mhm.
right? We go out to the Jack Henrys of the world and we buy that as a service. But we're literally outsourcing like some of the most important things that we have. How do we make sure that they're going to keep our data secure? How do we make sure that they
Yep.
have good processes and procedures internally, which we're going to talk about? But yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so I wanted to share just some examples, right? Just to kind of frame this in everybody's mind of like kind of stuff we're talking about, right? So I just have a
Mhm.
couple stories from the news. So SolarWinds, I think that's probably the most infamous of the supply chain attacks, right? Recently, that was in 2020. The attackers infiltrated and kind of masqueraded their way into the SolarWinds software update development environment, that update process. The news stories say, 18,000 customers, including Fortune 500, right? Government agencies, Mandiant, there were big high profile intrusions as a result of that. And that was, malicious code injected into a software development lifecycle, essentially.
Yep.
Okta is another one, 2023. The attackers compromised a service account. And that service account was for an Okta support employee, right? I believe it was some sort of support employee that had access to multiple customer tenants, right? So that was Okta themselves being compromised, and as a result, that company had access, into the various tenants that Okta customers, right?
Yeah.
134 customers. Move It was another one. That was a zero-day vulnerability in the Move It app itself, which is a file transfer service, exploited, and then the downstream impacts were this 0-day was used across a wide number of organizations, right? Because they had the same software version, the same product, the same app. So that one was a little different from SolarWinds. It's a little different from Okta. Again, still a supply chain, third party type of attack where you're attacking one product and kind of the downstream impacts are many customers affected. I have two more that are kind of interesting and still different. U.S. Treasury Department in 2024. So the Beyond Trust SaaS API key for the vendor that was used for technical support that was compromised. So that API key was compromised again. And that allowed sensitive access to sensitive data, workstations, et cetera, at the Treasury Department. And then the last example I have is DeepSeek API, or the DeepSeek AI, which was just recently. So there was a database exposed on the internet, right? And it had internal, yeah, surprising, right? Like an open S3 bucket kind of thing. So ClickHouse database was exposed. There was full control over the database, supposedly. So there was sensitive data, chat history, keys, API keys, secret keys, stuff like that, and other sensitive data. And that was highlights the supply chain vulnerability in AI platforms. So we've got all these different things. We've got these different types of attacks that we still kind of categorize as SaaS attacks. And it's important to keep in mind, I think, why this matters. And I think it would be good to cover that real quick, is that data exposure, right? There is a number of opportunities for these supply chain attacks to affect downstream customer data of a number of customers, right? From a single handful of customers to thousands of customers. There is the operational disruption of like having to shut a system down, or, when SolarWinds came out, like people were just shutting their network monitoring platforms down, the Orion platform, they were just shutting stuff down. CrowdStrike is another example. It wasn't necessarily a security incident, but a supply chain attack nonetheless. So operational disruption, data exposure, right? Data theft, and it's complex. So another thing that I think makes this truly difficult is these are essential business functions. These are essential systems and applications. But what's difficult is kind of identifying some of these things sometimes, especially with like the SolarWinds attack and the software development lifecycle. That seemed to be done really well. So these things can get pretty complex and pretty difficult to spot if we don't know the signals and what to look for. And obviously this has a widespread impact, right? Like SolarWinds had a huge impact. MoveIt had a huge impact. Yeah. Our data being exposed has a huge impact. So there are a lot of reasons why I think this topic is important, and I'm excited to cover this. Yeah.
I think SolarWinds put supply chain attacks on the map. Yep. There were some grumblings about it. You'd see a presentation at a conference before 2020, but that was an eye-opening experience. And I firmly believe that the MoveIt incident was slightly tempered.
Yep.
Because it came on the heels of everybody, being fresh on SolarWinds. Yep. And I had a lot of friends in the industry that were running SolarWinds at the time, and it was a bad day.
Yep.
And SolarWinds is an extremely popular network monitoring platform. MoveIt, by the way, is used by almost every financial institution in the U.S. and Western Europe.
Yeah,
so that is
massive footprint, and it's a product that many people probably, myself included, never heard about until that incident happened.
Yep. The only reason I had is, being involved in a financial institution. So I was familiar with MoveIt. But, I'll be honest with you, dude, even during the time period where I was evaluating security architecture and things of that nature, we were not taking into consideration, what happens if the core of the file transfer system is compromised, right? And so, now we are designing things to isolate, designing mechanisms to isolate, which we're going to talk about. But the point being is that, the landscape changed in a dramatic way in 2020. And we no longer look at the interconnectivity of our systems the same, because we have to assume all of them are compromised.
Yeah, and it just completely upended everyone's threat model, right? A fancy word of saying, like, what are the things that are going to hurt me, right? And before that, there, like you said, there weren't a lot of instances of like that kind of thing happening at that scale. And it's like, oh wait, this could happen. And it's like the CrowdStrike thing. It's like, oh wait, a vendor can push a bad patch to my endpoints, like without me knowing or saying okay, and I could just completely be down and lose, billions of dollars because of an outage. It's like, that's pretty wild. And that will change your perspective on a lot of things. So I
also remember the XZ utils backdoor. that was
Hmm.
introduced. Now, that was a wild story because they actually played the long game.
Yeah.
So someone actually like registered as a contributor to this project, which by the way is used by many different remote access tools, and they didn't introduce it for like what, a couple of years or something like that. I can't remember
Yep.
the timeline, but they were a sleeper for that long,
Yeah.
like actually making legitimate contributions to it, and then
Yep.
they flipped the switch, and within
Yeah.
days or weeks they had
Yeah.
pushed
That
out
was
the
wild.
case.
Darius and I did a podcast on that, I believe.
Yeah.
And we talked about it. That was I mean, that talk about like a espionage type, like long game thing.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
we could have a movie about that one.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so why? So we have the SaaS supply chain attacks versus regular supply chain attacks. I think we should probably delineate those a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, I think what you mentioned about the trucks earlier, right?
Hmm.
There's like physical supply chain of like goods and services and products and stuff like that. But when we talk about it in the context of this podcast, it's cloud native multi-tenant architecture. What makes SaaS supply chain attacks different from traditional is that, like I said, they're cloud native. These are cloud native products. They are living on the same hardware or the same hardware systems. They're distributed, right, across AWS or Azure or whatever the cloud platforms are, but they're multi-tenant. So like Okta has many customers, right? SolarWinds has many customers. MoveIt has many customers. And these SaaS products many times get the same code that's developed, right? They're part of the same software development lifecycle. So when there's a vulnerability identified, everybody kind of gets that patch all at once or kind of in a series. So there's the cloud native multi-tenant architecture that's one aspect. There is, the desire to have quick and timely and rapid development cycles, new features being released at a very, quick pace. And maybe
Hmm.
those aren't tested as much as they should, but also a high degree of third-party integrations. So APIs, libraries, plugins. When you look at a SaaS product, right, they're probably pulling in, it's not probably all, most SaaS products are not all fully homegrown, custom developed, right? There's just
Very
so
few.
many other great projects that have already done it. Like, why reinvent the wheel? So
Hmm.
these products are pulling this product from here, this API from there, this library from here. They're pulling it all in and like, duct tape and bubble gumming it all together to make this really cool SaaS product. But in doing so, they kind of lose sight of every single integration or thing that's there. And if that third party library, like we said, gets compromised, now your SaaS product has an issue.
Yeah, and I would contrast the SaaS style supply chains attacks with the like Move It, for example, and with SolarWinds. Those are on prem, running on hardware. You have at least some level of access and control to those systems, right? Like it's running on your server.
Yep.
If you nuke that thing from orbit, it ceases to exist. And moreover, you can implement some pretty good fences around these on-prem tools. SaaS is not that way, right?
Yep.
I mean, you have no access to where these things are running. You have no idea what the permissions on the containers are. In fact, you probably don't even know where the containers are. And so there is this it's just big black box,
Yep.
and you throw creds in there and data comes out and cool, and then we move on. But there's a lot of things behind the scenes that you have no access or visibility into, that creates significant risk for you.
Yep.
I mean, M365 is the perfect example, dude.
Hmm.
What happens if Microsoft turns off Outlook.com tomorrow?
Yep.
What are you gonna do?
Yep.
Right?
Exactly. And we've kind of touched on a lot of this stuff before. I think just kind of like double clicking into this stuff. So some key elements to be aware of when it comes to SaaS stuff. Third party APIs, right? Not all APIs are treated the same. I mean, you, Jordan, Darius, have all pen tested numerous APIs in your careers, web applications, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. But not all APIs are the same. Some have higher scrutiny of testing and especially security testing than others. They have there are different mechanisms for authenticating to these APIs that
Mhm.
have their own strengths and weaknesses. So that's one aspect, right? There's a bunch of these APIs with hooks and different authentication mechanisms that you have to figure out, and there are risks and kind of pros and cons with all those kinds of authentication mechanisms,
Mhm.
right? And a good example is Microsoft 365, which you mentioned, has tokens. So some of those tokens can be, stolen and replayed or stolen and used.
Mhm.
And Microsoft is trying to use conditional access policies and other things to help prevent that. But that's, just one aspect of authentication to a system. So libraries, you talked about the XYZ utils, right?
Mhm.
That's an example of a library that's used in a number of other projects and like Linux distributions all over from like the beginning of Linux kind of thing. So those libraries are used kind of throughout the projects. And like you said, if it's on GitHub, anybody can just submit a pull request and possibly get your code implemented in that project. And a lot of times, what happens is, there'll be malicious actors that will submit pub or PRs, push. I can't
Push
speak today.
requests.
Pull requests. Sorry, it's still early. I haven't had my second cup of coffee.
I'm just starting on
So
mine.
malicious actors will submit their own pull requests, right, with their own little malicious code hidden in there. Sometimes it's not as hidden as others, but then that's in the library. And if that library gets introduced in that software application, now that library can be used as a backdoor, something like that.
Yeah, dude. Here's the challenge, right? So if I put myself in the shoes of a SaaS provider, like you said, we're not writing stuff from scratch, dude. There's a million other great libraries out there.
Yep.
There are probably existing APIs to do functions. I'll tell you a fun story about that in just a second. And so how do I, as a SaaS provider, deal with what you just described? Because I
Mm-hmm.
guarantee you, anybody out there, you can pick any of these SaaS providers. They're using open source libraries. I guarantee
Yep.
it. Right? They're using precompiled, pre-built things, and so do they vet them properly? How do you
Yep.
know? Right? And you're already like two levels removed. So not only do you, as the consumer of a SaaS service, have no flipping idea what is actually in the code,
Mm-hmm.
but moreover, probably the people who wrote the SaaS application have no idea what's in the code,
Yep.
right? And then let's make it even deeper. They're probably consuming API or microservices from a provider that they have a business partnership with.
Yep.
So now you are indirectly tied into an organization you've never even heard of,
Yep.
and then and it goes on forever, right? Like we could
Mm-hmm.
literally just do this little hop jump thing indefinitely. And I read somewhere that we are two levels removed from everybody else on the planet, and
Yeah.
I think that that's also a
3 degrees
pretty
to Kevin Bacon or something, whatever it is,
yeah, yeah,
or
yeah,
six
yeah.
degrees or something.
Yeah, and so like I think the same thing could be said for the SaaS service web.
Yep.
That's a terrible choice of word, but this interconnectivity that we all have, right?
Yep.
And so my concern that's really what I'm thinking, right? And
Yep.
so the story that I'll tell you about that is we did a pen test this month actually on I want to say it was like an insurance provider or something like that. I don't remember, but what we realized is that they had purchased a relationship with another SaaS provider that validated mailing addresses. Right. So you know how sometimes if you fill out like an address form or whatever, it will check it for you and be like, oh, you
Mm-hmm.
filled it out this way. We think you actually meant, and then it will give you what it thinks is the correct address. Well, they had bought this SaaS service online from this other company. Well, their stuff was so jacked up, dude. And the problem you have is the way that they were sending the JSON request in the body. You couldn't really do a lot of validation on it, right? So they
Mm-hmm.
were basically doing a pass through to this other service provider to
Yep.
their API and then receiving the information back. And what we started realizing is that that company was using like Google services on the back end. So we're like 3 layers out now,
Yep.
and I control the interaction between all of these systems. And so anyway, long
Yep.
story short is like we were finding these things on this API pen test, and there were vulnerabilities that weren't even with the client that hired us.
Yep.
There were vulnerabilities with their downstream SaaS providers just because of
Yep.
the way that it was integrated. That's scary, dude.
Yep. Yeah, and there was an article that kind of spurred this topic for this podcast, and it was I forget the title exactly, but it was something like your third party risk isn't as bad as your fourth party risk or something like that.
Well said.
And I was kind of poking fun of the word or the terminology for it because like at what point is it just is it because third party risk is like obviously it's a party of the product that you're using, right? So if it's a SaaS product, it's like the API that it uses, right? And that's a third party. And then there's a fourth party and a fifth party. And like, what point is it just
I'm
like
going to write
supply
an
chain,
article that says eighth party, okay, just so I can be
right?
cooler than everybody else.
At what point does it like circle back around to you? But it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
But that is for lack of a better term right now, like fourth party is a legitimate thing.
Yeah.
It's the third party of your third party, and that was the tweet that I posted. Like, if it's a third party of your third party, is it a sixth party? But
Sounds like a good time either way.
yeah,
Right?
yeah. But the point here is that a flaw in a dependency is a flaw in the downstream products, right? And that's something I think is the most important aspect here to kind of be thinking of when we're using these products, procuring them, etc.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. Obviously, we have a limited amount of input into
Yep.
these, right? And it's really easy for me to sit here in this room and say, well, you should just do a better job of vetting your third parties.
Yep.
Okay, how?
Yep.
Right. And let's make it even more complicated. That same presentation that I did last week, one of the questions that came up was, what do we do about
Yep.
these third party providers? And moreover, what do we do with the ones we already have? Because that's
Yep.
a whole different question. Right. So
Yep.
let's talk about, some things that we can do within the organization to elevate our, I guess, defensive posture against
Yep.
eighth party. We're going to do that now. Eighth party
Eighth party.
supply chain attacks.
The eighth party, the Kevin Bacon supply chain attacks. Yeah. So when it comes to defensive advice, the first thing that comes to my mind, just like being in a like sysadmin and then a security role before, like using software applications, having to manage applications in a corporate environment, is just a third party assessment. Whether that's you doing the assessment or you contracting somebody like, hey, can you go vet this vendor? Can you go pen test this software company for me? Or getting the reports from the vendor itself, which maybe not as ideal in my opinion, but at least it's something, and they have some sort of a process for assessing it. But vetting and continuously monitoring those third-party vendors, those APIs, those plugins, those libraries, and trying to do your best to ensure that they uphold a level of security, they uphold some standard level of security, and they do their own audits. They're thinking about security, they're cognizant of it, they're aware of it. Obviously, that's easier said than done, right? Like, how do you continuously manage all your third-party libraries? It's like there are products out there that try to sell you that. In reality, it's not that easy. But I think that's the first step, is just making sure you really evaluate what products you're using, what SaaS products you're integrating with. And that's, I think, the first step.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to spend a little extra time on this particular defensive mechanism because it's really important, right? So depending on where you are in the chain, right? So I'm going to start out like I'm the consumer. I'm a construction company,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and I need to go buy a third party SaaS service. It starts with the procurement and evaluation process. That is step number one. Okay, you need to get legal involved in this, and I'm going to explain why.
Mm-hmm.
Most organizations receive the sales contract from this third party SaaS provider, or we're just going to call it a SaaS provider because it gets a little diluted. But and they sign it and they buy the product, and they have now eliminated any possibility of recourse for them to investigate the security practices of their new partner,
Yep.
or to even do anything with regards to like monetary compensation for issues. And so we have a client that I think is like the model for this, right? And I think you're working on them next week, hopefully. And so their model is that they introduce legal language in the contract. Like one of the clauses in the contract is we have the right to procure a third party to pen test you. And so they're literally hiring us to pen test one of their partners, right?
Yep.
That is almost unheard of in the US. Like, it's very unusual for something like that to happen. But
Yep.
you don't have to do it that way. You can also request that they have an annual or biannual pen test, and
Yep.
that they provide the results. And again, we're talking about contract language, which means if they don't do it, they're in violation of the contract, and there's either compensation or termination.
Yep.
And so that is where this whole thing starts, man. Now,
Yep.
we have a different problem. We start talking about like libraries, right? That's a whole different issue. That's something you have to vet on your own. But when you're creating relationships with SaaS
Yep.
providers, you absolutely have to make teeth in the contract to support it. And by the way, most people don't realize this. You can ask for anything. You can ask for them to give you their entire security program documentation, which,
Yep.
by the way, many of them will give you.
Yep.
And you can identify gaps in their security program.
Yep.
And so there are protections you can put contractually in place to protect you from this.
Yep.
That is where I would say to start. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's a good contrast between the technical, like, implementer aspects of it that I mentioned, and like the contractual, leadership type of approach to the problem. Like, there's multiple angles that you have to tackle it at. It's important to keep those in mind. But if you don't, like, the outcome is like the company's going to be indemnified of any wrongdoing or any any responsibility or anything like that, because why wouldn't you if you're a company, right? And you have to negotiate those things.
Yep. And so you can, make the request for their pen test report. So that's one of the things so I was integrated into the procurement process at the bank that I worked at, and my only job was to read pen test reports.
Yep.
So like, I would get a pen test report from somebody we wanted to do business with. I would look at it and I would say, okay, these are the things that we care about. One, is it a legitimate pen test, right? There were a lot of things that weren't, but that process really helped us eliminate. We saved ourselves at one point, I think $64 million, because we were working through the procurement process. We're going to buy this really expensive bleeding edge online banking platform. They didn't have a pen test. And I was like, okay, unfortunate, weird for an online banking platform not to have a penetration test. And I was like, okay, why don't we do it? We'll do it for you, right? We'll pay for the service. We'll do the work. We did. It was awful. Like, it was horrendous. And we fired him. And we never got to the point of having a signed contract worth these millions of dollars, because we identified this lack of security controls and process early on in the relationship. It's the only way I know to do it, man. Because by the time you sign a contract and you figure 6 months later during implementation that, all of their passwords are password, you're like, holy shit, dude, what do I do now? Well, now you have a problem.
Yep, exactly. So another kind of defensive advice item and this one kind of is for companies who have these third-party software products, and you host them on-prem or you host them yourselves, like Move It, things like that, is quote unquote zero trust, which to me is like least privilege, right? It's isolation, it's restriction, it's segmentation. Those are principles that I think of when I think of zero trust. So if you have a Move It, if you have some software product that you host, you don't need to have it, just on your flat network, right? The user subnet and where all the servers are and things like that. It should be isolated, put it in a DMZ, properly restrict it, and have that be more or less an island, so that if it does become compromised, right? If there is a 0 day for it, it's not going to take the entire company down. And that's at a very deep topic with a lot of nuance to it. But as a general recommendation of advice, if you have something on the internet, it should absolutely be DMZ'd, restricted, isolated, segmented from everything else. And if you can at all avoid it, just get it off of your internal network at all. And I think that's a big benefit to cloud, is like, okay, it's this cloud product now, and you can kind of isolate it a little bit more in many ways. But that is a very important aspect for defenders, like, who are hosting some of these products.
Yeah, man. And if you're integrating with third-party SaaS stuff, you need to put fences around that integration. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the example that I told you before, where this API had another API, I want to build controls in my API that I have control over, to protect myself from their downstream API.
Mhm.
Right? I'm going to ask the question, what's the worst case scenario, and then we're going to work backwards from there. And even if you're just consuming an API, right? So let's say that you are that construction company and you need to be able to validate addresses or whatever the case may be. To your point, it's not just physical segmentation where I'm like, I'm only going to allow communication from this IP on this port,
Mhm.
whatever. There's more to it. Now we're integrating with something from an application perspective. Those controls are going to have to exist within your integration. So
Yep.
whatever you're connecting with is where those controls have to exist. So segmentation
Yep.
is possible. The concept of zero trust is possible with SaaS products, with these
Yep.
integrations. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's possible.
Yep. Yeah, I think the next one, and we don't have to cover every single one, but the continuous delivery, continuous development stuff, I think you're positioned pretty well in your experience to touch on. But it's just hardening and developing a good process for your code release, your code development lifecycle, but
Mhm.
integrating security checks and security assessments and evaluations to that code. And I know you've got a lot of experience in that, so I think it'd be good for you to kind of touch on what
Mhm.
SaaS products, what software vendors can do. If anybody's listening that is from that world, or what they should be doing, right? If you're an IT person, what should these products be doing to secure these development life cycles, these development processes, so that you can ask them, right? If you're going out and you're buying a software product,
Mhm.
these are some of the questions you might want to ask of like, hey, how do you ensure that there's like no malicious code, or it's limited, or how do you handle that if it happens, those kinds of things.
Yeah, so we could have an entire podcast on this subject.
Sure.
We had a pen test not long ago. If I told you the name of the company, you would immediately know them, no matter who you are. They're a household name. And what we realized, when we were having our discussions with them, that we were like, okay, so how are you guys isolating like your dev environment, your prod environment, your developers, all that stuff? They're like, oh, it's totally like segmented off, right? Which is cool, except for like the staging environment, it was like anybody could write to the code. And I was like, okay, so
Yeah, why
how are
not?
we? Yeah, I mean, like it's just staging or dev or whatever it is, right? And it's a development company, so why wouldn't everybody be able to write to that? But there was a distinct lack of validation as it moved through the stages toward production. So if I were to introduce something that was not signatured, right? So you had mentioned like doing vulnerability scanning, SAST, DAST, dynamic and static application security scanning. So even introducing those things might not catch this. What I would say is it just starts with very basic role-based access control and
Mhm.
least privilege, right? If fewer people can commit junk into your code, your job's going to get a lot easier.
Yep.
And if you are validating it at every stage as it's being promoted from one stage to the next, that's really the whole concept of DevSecOps, right? As much as I hate that phrase, that's where I'm going to start. If, if
Yep.
if I'm if I'm a SaaS provider, I'm going to ensure that I'm implementing security at every step of the DevOps or CI/CD process.
Yep.
So I could go on forever, but we're already like way
Yeah.
over on time,
Yeah.
so I'm
We'll
just going to stop.
we'll wrap it up. Just one more quick thing that I just will rapid fire. Stuff that is obviously we're biased, but I think everybody should be doing as much as possible on the things that are most important are pen tests,
Mhm.
right? Like we're pen testers by trade, security people, but regular pen testing these things, and there's a good saying that you have, like if there's a big button on a website or in a SaaS product that says hack me, a lot of times those vulnerability scanners won't find that, right?
Correct.
And vulnerability scanners are not going to look at the business logic of an application and how things are integrated together. There's a lot of things that you'll miss if you just do vulnerability scanning. So penetration testing, actually trying to exploit things
Yep.
or abuse the functionality of the product or the website or the API, is a very, very important part of security testing, of having a holistic security program. So that's really important.
Yep. Dude, so
Um,
that
yeah, go ahead.
instance of me finding the address validation API downstream,
Yep.
no amount of security scanning, no amount of source code analysis,
Hmm.
is ever going to find that. You don't have their source code, dude. Your
Yep.
integration is literally like a freaking config file and a URL. And so the only way you find that is through pen testing.
Yep.
I mean, and because again, we actually were doing some source code review for these guys, and hey, everything looks pretty cool, man. Very good. I see there's some APIs calling other APIs. We'll get to that at the pen test. We get to it at the pen test, and holy smokes, here we are.
Yep.
So there are a large number of things that you will only find through a thorough penetration test, and
Yep.
that's the reason that we advocate so hard for it.
Yep. Yeah, the last two I'll mention quickly are just patching, right? Obviously, with 0 days, there is no patch. It's the definition of a 0 day, right? It's a vulnerability that exists pre-patch. But as soon as there are patches or when there are critical vulnerabilities announced or released, whether it's VMware or Palo Alto or Citrix or whatever,
Yep.
being able to quickly patch those things and get them up to date and get them secured is pivotal to defending your organization. We're seeing now, and there are multiple reports, numerous reports that corroborate this, right? Is that
Mhm.
when there's a vulnerability, the time to exploit, the time between when an attacker gets that information and develops some sort of exploit or abuse for that mechanism
Could
or
be
that
hours.
product is minuscule, right? It's significant, exponentially decreased over time,
Mhm.
and especially now with security researchers that want to, for lack of a better word, get fame or have some notoriety for identifying and discovering this thing and creating a proof of concept for it. Many times it ends up shooting defenders in the foot because they give them the map to recreating these things, and it's a very delicate balance between disclosure and kind of holding on to it until defenders can kind of get patched and stuff. But the
Mhm.
important thing to know is that the time to exploit has decreased significantly. So you
Mhm.
have to be able to patch quickly, or you have to just take it off the internet. You have to do something quickly and respond to it very, very fast. So you have to have the flexibility in the team and the people and the resources to be able to do that,
Mhm.
and then have a plan, right? Like you have to have a plan for when stuff goes wrong. And I think that's foundational to security in and of itself. So of all the things that we talked about, the plan is one of the most important things of like, this will happen. It will happen to a product that you use. What is your protocol? How are you going to handle this? How do
Mhm.
you respond? What do you do in these certain situations? So using tabletop exercises or just sitting down at a table and talking about it with your team, how do we handle this stuff? What are we going to do? Is a really good exercise. So you're prepared before it happens.
No question. No question about it, man. All right, folks, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for listening or watching. If you're on YouTube, if you enjoyed this, please share it with your network, and check us out over at offsec.blog or securit360.com. We'll see you next week.